By the morning of October 23rd, 1993, 4 tractors in Custer County were dead. Chester Briggs's wasn't one of them. That single fact cost him 3 years of his life to earn. The loan officer at First National Bank in Broken Bow had a name that Chester would not forget: Gerald Keller, 40 years old, give or take. A suit that had never seen a machine shed, a desk that smelled like new carpet and ambition. Keller had the particular confidence of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that he had stopped noticing it was bad. He slid the paper across the desk with 2 fingers. Chester looked at the number, then he looked at the man, then he looked at the number again. $89,320. That was what the Briggs farm had spent on diesel fuel in 1990 alone. Not seed, not fertilizer, not the operating line that carried them from March to November every year. Just fuel. Just the cost of keeping 3 John Deere tractors moving across 1,100 acres of Custer County ground that his grandfather had broken out of native prairie in 1929 with a team of horses and a walking plow. Keller explained the situation in the tone of a man reading a weather report. The operating line was at its ceiling. Fuel expenditure had exceeded projections 3 years running. The bank required demonstrated cost reduction of $18,000 annually before it would consider renewal in the spring of 1993. 18 months. That was the runway. 18 months to find $18,000 that wasn't there. Or the bank would not extend the line that paid for seed and fertilizer every spring. And without that line, there was no crop. And without the crop, there was no farm. Keller did not say that last part out loud. He did not need to. Chester had been farming since 1972. He understood subtraction. The drive home on Route 2 took 20 miles and felt longer. The fields on both sides of the road were gray and frozen and flat all the way to the tree line. The radio stayed off. Chester pulled into the yard and sat in the truck for a while before he went inside. Nora was at the kitchen counter when he came through the door. She did not turn around, but she had heard the truck pull in and heard the particular way he closed the door, which was not the way a man closes a door when things have gone well. And she listened to the sound of his boots on the linoleum and waited. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, and took out a yellow legal pad and a pencil. Nora finished what she was doing at the counter and turned around and looked at him once. And then she began making coffee because that was the thing to do when a man sits down with a legal pad and a pencil and says nothing. Chester wrote numbers for 40 minutes, the fuel cost, the parts budget, the service costs for 3 tractors that each needed annual maintenance from Pinnacle Iron 12 miles east on Route 2, the land payment, the operating line payment, the gross revenue projection for 1,100 acres of corn and soybeans on flat ground with good drainage and reliable yields. Then he subtracted everything from everything else. The number at the bottom was $19,000. He sat looking at it. 19,000 was not a margin. It was a countdown. On a farm projecting $310,000 in gross revenue, with $291,000 in annual operating costs, $19,000 was the distance between staying and going. And Gerald Keller had just said he needed to find 18,000 more of it. Chester got up and went to the drawer again, not the legal pad this time. He took out a small notebook with a brown leather cover worn soft at the corners. The leather was cracked along the spine and the pages had gone yellow at the edges. His grandfather had carried it in the front pocket of his overalls from 1931 to 1944, recording every cost and every yield and every repair on the farm in pencil so light that some of the early entries had nearly faded through. He set it on the table beside the legal pad and opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was small and careful. April 14th, 1931. Fuel, kerosene, 12 gallons, 0.18. Seed corn, 40 pounds, 1.20. Chester read the entries the way a man reads something he has read before, not for information, but for steadiness. His grandfather had kept this farm when the bank came for it in 1933 and again in 1936. Kept it by knowing exactly what everything cost and exactly what everything was worth, and by not spending the distance between those two numbers on anything that did not matter. He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Then he wrote one more line at the bottom of the legal pad: Nebraska Tractor Test Lab. Underlined it twice. He spent the next 3 weeks reading. The Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory published consumption figures for every machine sold in the state. Chester had known about the reports for years, in the way a farmer knows about things he has never needed. Now he needed them. He drove to the county extension office in Broken Bow and asked for back issues going to 1985, and sat at a table in the back room with a stack of technical documents and a cup of coffee that went cold and read for 4 hours. The same name kept appearing at the low end of every fuel consumption column: Deutz Alice. Most Nebraska farmers knew the name the way Chester knew it, which was barely. Deutz was German. In the mid-1980s, the company had partnered with Alice Chalmers to sell air-cooled diesel tractors in the American market under the Deutz Alice name. The experiment had lasted less than a decade. American farmers did not trust air-cooled engines. The dealers who signed on could not sell enough units to stay interested. By 1990, the name was gone, absorbed into a company called AGCO, and the tractors that remained in American fields were orphans, still running, no longer supported. Chester did not care about the name. He cared about the column of numbers. Air-cooled Deutz diesels burned 10 to 15% less fuel per horsepower hour than any liquid-cooled engine in their class. The test numbers said it plainly. On an operation consuming 63,000 gallons of diesel per year, a 10% reduction meant 6,000 gallons. At $1.40 per gallon, that was $8,400. 15% meant $12,600. The gap between those numbers and Keller's $18,000 requirement was real, but it was smaller than the gap between staying and going. Chester also read what the test documents did not say, which was everything about parts availability and dealer networks, and the particular loneliness of running a machine that no mechanic within 2 hours had ever opened. He made a separate column on the legal pad for those costs and left the dollar amounts blank because he did not know them yet. A 1987 Deutz Alice 9170 appeared on the consignment listing for Hatton Auctions in Kearney in early March 1991. 160 horsepower, air-cooled F6L, 913 six-cylinder diesel, 2,800 hours, one owner, stored inside. Starting price, $27,500. Chester drove to Kearney on a Tuesday. He did not tell anyone where he was going. The machine was sitting apart from the other equipment in the consignment yard, the way something sits when it does not belong to the category of things around it. The paint was Deutz green, not John Deere green, a slightly different shade that looked foreign against the Nebraska sky. He walked around it 3 times before touching it, checked the tire wear and the frame welds, and the condition of the hydraulic lines, and the play in the 3-point hitch. Looked at the fin cylinders, 6 of them arranged in a row, with cooling fins machined into the aluminum like the pages of a book standing upright. The axial fan sat behind them in a tin shroud, designed to pull air straight through from front to back in a single clean line. The space where a radiator should have been felt wrong, the way a house feels wrong when you take out a wall that has always been there. He sat in the cab. It was quieter than expected. The controls were in different places than a John Deere, and the dash was simpler, and everything was functional, but arranged differently, like sitting in someone else's kitchen where the silverware drawer is on the wrong side. August Decker had run the consignment desk at Hatton for 11 years. He was the kind of man who told you the truth because he had been in the business long enough to know that lies came back. He had sold Deutz Alice machines when the brand was still active in the American market, and he knew the 917. Oh, the way a man knows a specific tool he has used many times. Decker said the 9170 was the best of the air-cooled line. a six-cylinder that pulled like a tractor 40 horsepower bigger and used less fuel doing it. He also told Chester the rest. If the injection pump failed, the part came from a warehouse in Germany and clearing customs took 3 weeks on a good month. If a head gasket failed, the nearest mechanic who understood Deutz air-cooled engines was in Lincoln, 2 hours south. There was no pinnacle iron for this machine. No parts counter 12 miles down the road. There was August Decker and a phone number in Lincoln and a lot of patience. Chester called Nora from a payphone at the truck stop on the edge of Kearney. He told her what he had found and what it cost and what he thought it could save and what he knew it could not. Told her about Decker and the injection pump and the 3 weeks from Germany. Gave her the numbers the way he had written them on the legal pad. Nora listened without saying anything until he was finished. Then she was quiet for a moment longer. She said, "You know what people are going to say." Chester said he did. She said, "And you're going to do it anyway." It was not a question. He did not answer it like one. The following week, he drove to Pinnacle Iron. Frank Steele managed the dealership from an office with a window that looked out over the service bay. A man who had been in the same county his entire life and knew it, which gave him a particular confidence about how things worked and who was who and what decisions made sense. Frank shook Chester's hand and listened to what he had to say about the trade, and then walked out to look at the 4840 and came back and wrote a number on a piece of paper. $21,500. Chester said that was fine. Frank put his hands in his pockets and looked at the man across the desk, the way a man looks at something he cannot quite categorize. He said, "You're going from a 4840 to a Deutz Alice." The way he said it carried everything he thought about the decision without him having to elaborate. Chester signed the paperwork and drove home. He brought the Deutz back from Kearney on a Wednesday, following the two-lane roads at 35 miles an hour because the machine's top road speed barely exceeded that and he did not want to push it on the first day. 4 hours. When he pulled into the yard, the afternoon light was low and the machine shed was open, and the two remaining John Deere 4440s were parked inside, and the Deutz Alice pulled in beside them and sat there looking like something that had wandered into the wrong building and was too uncertain of itself to leave. Chester cut the engine and sat in the cab in the quiet and listened to the ticking of the cooling fins. No thermostat cycling, no coolant circulating, just metal contracting in the cold air. The sound of a machine that had no liquid inside it to worry about. Dale Mercer spotted it the next morning. Dale farmed 800 acres south of the Briggs place and drove the same stretch of county road every morning on his way to the co-op. He saw the green machine through the open door of the shed and pulled his truck into the driveway and sat for a moment before he got out. Walked around the Deutz the way Chester had walked around it in Kearney, checking the fin cylinders and the fan shroud and the empty space at the front of the engine where every tractor Dale had ever operated kept its radiator. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, in the particular way a man shakes his head when he sees something so obviously wrong that explaining it would be an insult to both parties. "Chester," Dale said. "What the hell is that?" Chester told him. Dale said, "That thing doesn't even have a radiator." Chester said that was the point. Dale left without another word. He was at the co-op in Broken Bow before 9 in the morning, and the story traveled faster than he did. Within a week, every farmer in Custer County knew that Chester Briggs had traded his 4840 for a German tractor with no radiator. The details got worse with each telling, the way details always do when a story moves through a county where men talk at grain elevators and implement dealers and the gas station on Main Street. The machine was undersized, unreliable, a repair bill waiting to arrive from overseas. Chester had traded a perfectly good piece of American iron for something no mechanic in Nebraska could fix. The phrase German toy appeared within 3 days, and it stuck with the permanence of a county verdict, which is a different thing from a judgment, because judgments can be appealed and verdicts just sit there. At Pinnacle Iron, Frank made his position clear through distance rather than words. When Chester called for hydraulic filters for the Deutz that first spring, the parts desk said they did not stock them, and it would take 2 weeks to source. 2 weeks. for filters. Chester ordered them and waited. Virgil Cross was the exception. Virgil farmed 600 acres north of the Briggs place and had always been the kind of man who watched things carefully before he opened his mouth. He stopped by one evening in late April when Chester had the Deutz running at the edge of the field, idling while Chester walked the headland checking soil conditions. Virgil leaned against the fender and listened to the engine for a while. Then he asked about fuel consumption. Chester gave him the straight numbers. The Deutz was burning approximately 7.5 gallons per hour on heavy field work. The 4840 had burned 11. On 2,400 hours per year, that was 8,400 gallons saved. At $1.40 a gallon, it came to $11,760. Virgil did not whistle, did not express surprise. He just nodded the way a man nods when a number confirms something he already suspected. He said, "That is a lot of diesel." Then he drove away. Chester stood in the field and thought about Virgil for a moment. Virgil had a brother who had lost a farm in Phelps County in 1978. Equipment costs had been part of it. Chester did not know if Virgil was thinking about that or about something else entirely, but the quality of his attention had been different from Dale's, different from the co-op talk, different from the silence at the parts desk. Virgil had listened to the number the way a man listens to a number that matters. The Deutz ran through spring tillage without complaint, through planting in May, through summer cultivation. The fuel gauge told Chester what the Nebraska test numbers had said it would, and every time he filled the tank, the savings were real and specific and written down on the legal pad in the kitchen. But the social cost did not diminish with time. At the co-op, the jokes did not stop. They changed shape, became more elliptical, the kind of humor that does not require the subject to be present because everyone already knows the punchline. Chester heard the edges of it when he came in for seed or stopped for coffee. The slight recalibration of the room when he walked through the door, the conversations that continued in a slightly different register. Nora felt it more directly. The women she had known for 20 years at First Lutheran were not unkind to her, but there is a particular kind of social warmth that exists in small communities, and that warmth had a temperature. And the temperature around Nora Briggs had dropped in a way that everyone could feel and no one acknowledged. She stopped arriving early to church, stopped staying late, did what was necessary, and came home. She did not tell Chester this, but one evening in August, he came in from the field and found her sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the overhead light off, the room lit only by what came through the window from the yard. She was not doing anything, just sitting. He asked if she was all right. Nora said she was just tired. Chester sat down across the table from her. He did not turn the light on. They sat there in the partial dark for a while without talking, and he understood without being told what kind of tired she meant. It was not the kind that sleep fixed. He did not apologize. There was nothing to apologize for. The numbers were right, and the decision was right, and the alternative was Keller's paper and a farm that would not survive another 3 years of $89,000 fuel bills. But understanding that a decision is correct does not make the costs of it disappear. And Chester sat in the dark across from his wife and felt both things at the same time. The Deutz sat in the machine shed 30 yards away, cooling in the August dark. In July of 1992, Chester drove to Broken Bow and sat down across from Gerald Keller for the second time. He had the legal pad with him, set it on the desk, and turned it so Keller could read the numbers. 18 months of fuel logs, side-by-side consumption comparisons, the 4840's historical average against the Deutz's actual performance across 14 months of field work. The math was not complicated. The Deutz had saved $11,400 in fuel in its first full year. Combined with a reduction in service costs from eliminating one machine from the Pinnacle Iron maintenance schedule, the total operating cost reduction exceeded $13,000 annually. It was not $18,000, but it was real. It was documented, and it was sustainable. Keller looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked up and back down at the numbers. He clicked his pen twice. said he would need to consult with the branch manager before confirming renewal. Chester said he understood. Keller called 3 days later. The operating line would be renewed for the spring of 1993. He did not say the numbers were good. He did not say anything had been proven. He said the bank was prepared to continue the relationship subject to the standard terms. Chester thanked him and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, took the brown leather notebook out of the drawer and set it on the table and opened it to the first page. His grandfather's handwriting in the faded pencil. April 14th, 1931. Chester closed the notebook and put it back. Then he went out to the machine shed and checked the Deutz's oil and transmission fluid and hydraulic reservoir and blew the dust off the fin cylinders with a parts brush. And when he was done, he stood in the shed door and looked out at the flat ground of Custer County in the late afternoon light. The same ground his grandfather had looked at from the same position in the same season 60 years before. The machine behind him was strange and foreign and came from somewhere that had no particular relationship to this place or this soil or this sky. But it was running, and so was the farm. That was what mattered. Chester turned off the shed light and went inside. He had bought himself another year. That was all it was. Not vindication, not proof. Just another year on the same ground, with the same machine, and the same silence at the co-op that had replaced the laughter without replacing what the laughter meant. The winter of 1992 settled into the county and did not announce when it planned to leave. Chester ran maintenance on the Deutz through January and February, cleaning the fin cylinders with the parts brush, checking the valve clearances, going through the hydraulic system the way August Decker had walked him through it in that consignment yard in Kearney. The work was different from maintaining the John Deeres. Quieter, more particular, no coolant to flush, no thermostat to test, no radiator hoses to squeeze for soft spots. There was the engine and the air around it and the fins that connected one to the other. And if the fins were clean, and the oil was right, and the fuel system was sound, the machine ran. Chester had learned to trust that simplicity, the way you learn to trust something that has not failed you yet, which is different from trusting something you believe in. Spring came late to Custer County in 1992 and came wrong. The first week of April was cold and wet, and the fields were too soft to plant. The second week was the same. Chester ran the Deutz through some light field preparation on the drier ground near the road, and the machine performed the way it always performed, steady and even and indifferent to his opinion of it. He had been watching the injection pump since late March. The engine was harder to start on cold mornings than it had been the previous fall. Not dramatically harder, just a few extra seconds on the crank, a slightly rougher idle for the first minute, the kind of thing a man who ran a different machine every day would not notice. Chester noticed it because he ran this machine every day and knew its rhythms the way you know the particular sound of a door in your own house. He called August Decker on a Thursday morning in the second week of April. Decker listened to the description without interrupting. Then he said what Chester already suspected: the injection pump. On the F6L913 engine, it was a precision German component, a Bosch unit calibrated to tolerances that no machine shop in Custer County or anywhere near it could match. One source for the replacement: a parts warehouse outside Frankfurt. The order would need to go through a distributor in Chicago. Customs clearance added time. Best case, 23 days from the day the order was placed. Chester placed the order that afternoon. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Outside the window, the fields were gray and flat and waiting. The soil temperature in the east quarter had been reading 51 degrees for 3 days, 1 degree below the threshold for corn germination. In another week, it would be warm enough. In another week, the Deutz would be sitting in the shop with its injection pump removed and a parts box somewhere between Frankfurt and Chicago. He went to the machine shed and looked at the Deutz, then looked at the phone on the wall of the shed, a rotary phone the color of old bone that his father had installed in 1968. He thought about Frank's steel at Pinnacle Iron, thought about what it would cost to rent a machine for the planting season, or whether Frank would sell a used 4440 on short terms. Thought about what that conversation would sound like. Thought about Dale Mercer hearing about it at the co-op the following morning. Then he thought about the legal pad on the kitchen table and the number Keller had written in the margin with a ballpoint pen. $13,000 saved. Confirmed. Renewed. Chester walked back to the house and did not call Frank Steele. He planted what he could with the 2444s and waited. The parts box arrived 23 days after the order went in, which was the best case Decker had described and felt nothing like it. It came in a cardboard box with German customs tape along the seam and a packing slip Chester could not read. He set it on the workbench and opened it carefully. The way you open something that traveled a long distance to get to you. The replacement pump was smaller than expected, precise and dense, machined to tolerances you could feel when you ran a fingertip across the mating surfaces. Chester had the service manual, a photocopied document Decker had sourced from a technical library in Lincoln and mailed the previous fall. Some pages translated into approximate English by a man Decker knew who had worked for a Deutz importer in the 1980s. Chester had read it 3 times over the winter. He read the relevant section twice more before he touched the engine. He pulled the old pump and installed the new one over 2 days, working methodically, checking each step against the manual, tightening each fastener to the specified torque with a wrench that had belonged to his father. On the morning of the 3rd day, he bled the fuel system and cycled the engine. It started on the 2nd crank and ran smooth from the first idle. The rough morning starts were gone. The hesitation at low throttle was gone. The engine ran the way it had run the day Chester bought it, clean and even, and with that particular Deutz sound that was not quite like any American diesel he had ever run. He had lost 3 weeks of planting season. Chester put in 18-hour days through the last week of April and the first days of May, running all 3 machines together, the seed going into ground that was warm enough and dry enough and ready. By mid-May, he knew the 1992 crop would come in below projection, but within a range the operating numbers could absorb. It was not a good year. It was a survivable one. No one in Custer County knew the injection pump had failed. Chester had not told anyone. Virgil had not asked. Dale had driven past the farm 3 times during the 3 weeks the Deutz sat in the shed with its fuel system open and had not stopped. And Chester did not know whether Dale had noticed the machine was absent from the field or whether he simply had not been looking. That summer had a particular quality Chester would remember later as the quality of a thing that is holding together but showing where the seams are. Nora moved through the house in the weeks with a careful efficiency that had replaced the ease she used to carry. She cooked and kept the books and went to church on Sundays and came home and did not complain about any of it. But the ease was gone, and Chester felt its absence the way you feel a sound that has stopped, not loudly, just as a changed quality in the air around you. One evening in late July, she said something he did not answer right away. She said, "How long do you think this goes on?" Chester looked up from the table. She said, "The way people are." How long? He thought about it honestly, said he did not know, said the machine was saving what it was supposed to save, and the bank had renewed the line and the farm was standing. Said he thought eventually the county would move on to something else to talk about. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know the numbers are right." She did not say anything else, but the way she said it told Chester that the numbers being right was a true thing and a separate thing at the same time, separate from what it cost her on Sunday mornings and at the grain elevator and at the school board meetings where she sat 2 rows behind Margaret Mercer, and neither of them said a word about what their husbands had said to each other and what it had meant. Chester said, "I know." It was the most honest conversation they had about it. After that, they did not speak of it directly again. The fall of 1992 was dry and clean, and the harvest came in fast. Chester ran the Deutz, pulling the grain cart, and it performed without incident, and the fuel numbers at the end of the season confirmed what the spring numbers had said. The machine was doing what the Nebraska test reports had promised. The math was working. The farm was still standing. But in Custer County in 1992, that was not a story anyone was interested in telling. The summer of 1993 arrived without particular announcement and with a heat that established itself by late June and did not apologize. Chester planted on time that spring for the first time since buying the Deutz, the injection pump running clean, and the three machines working together through a dry April that broke into a perfect planting window the second week of May. Gerald Keller had renewed the operating line in March without requesting a meeting. Chester received the confirmation letter in the mail and read it at the kitchen table and set it down and went back to the shed. He did not feel the need to mark the occasion. Keller's letter was not an acknowledgement that anything had been proven. It was a bank document. Chester treated it like one. By late June, the corn was waist high in the east quarter, and the soybeans in the west quarter had closed the rows, and the farm looked the way a farm is supposed to look in early summer, orderly and full and in the early stages of becoming what it is going to be. Chester walked the fields in the evenings the way his grandfather had walked them, checking for pests and disease and the kind of small problems that become large ones if you let them develop unobserved. It was August when the weather changed the first time. Not dramatically, just a shift in the pattern, a wetness that came into the air from the south and settled over the county like something that had decided to stay. The corn was in its late vegetative stages, and the beans were beginning to set pods, and the timing was acceptable. Chester watched the soil moisture and adjusted his plans, and did not worry yet. September is when he started to pay attention. The rain came every third day, not violent rain, not the kind that washes out creek crossings and fills road ditches, just steady, persistent, gray sky rain that turned the fields to soup and left standing water in the low spots and made the county roads slick with a particular Nebraska mud that packs into tire treads and stays there. The corn was ready. The beans were ready. The ground was not. Every farmer in Custer County was behind schedule by the second week of September, and the pressure was building in the specific way it builds when a crop is ready and the earth will not let you have it. Chester ran the Deutz through the wet conditions the way he ran it through everything, steadily and without ceremony. The machine pulled the grain cart through mud that came up over the axle, the six-cylinder diesel holding its revolutions at a rate that did not vary with the load the way a struggling engine varies. What he was also watching, though he did not say this to anyone, was the radiators. On every liquid-cooled tractor in the county, the wet conditions were doing something the operators would not fully understand until it was too late to matter. The mud spraying up from the fields and the chaff coming off the crops were mixing in the air and landing on the radiator screens and fins of every John Deere in the county. And with each day, the accumulation grew thicker, and the airflow through the cores grew slower, and the engine temperatures climbed a fraction of a degree at a time, which is how cooling systems fail. Not all at once, but in the particular way that gradual things fail, invisibly and then completely. Dale's 444 overheated for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of September. Chester heard about it at the co-op 2 days later, not because Dale told him, but because Dale had called Pinnacle Iron for a service appointment and the parts desk had mentioned it to two other customers in the course of normal business, which is how information travels in a county where everyone buys their supplies from the same three places. Dale had blown the radiator out with compressed air and refilled the coolant and gone back to work. Chester was in his own field that afternoon, running the Deutz through a section of standing corn near the north fence line. He stopped at the headland and got down and walked to the edge of the field and looked north toward Dale's property. He could see the green cab of the 444 moving through the rows a half-mile away, running again. The overheating resolved for the moment. Chester walked back to the Deutz and looked at the fin cylinders. He took the parts brush from the toolbox behind the cab and brushed the mud off the cooling fins, which took 6 minutes, and checked the fan shroud for debris, which took 2 more. That was the complete maintenance procedure for the Deutz's cooling system. He put the brush back and climbed into the cab and put the machine in gear. Dale's 4, 4, 4, 0 overheated again. 4 days later. Then a third time. On the third occasion, the thermostat stuck in the closed position before Dale caught the temperature gauge climbing, and the coolant boiled over fast enough that by the time he smelled it and looked at the dash and got the machine stopped, the engine had been running in the red for 90 seconds. Dale limped the tractor back to his machine shed and spent the rest of that day cleaning radiator fins with a wire brush and a garden hose in the rain. Chester knew about this not because Dale told him, but because Leon Boone mentioned it at the grain elevator when Chester was waiting to dump a load in the third week of September. Leon said Dale had a radiator problem and left it at that. Chester said he was sorry to hear it. Neither of them looked at the other when they said it, and neither of them mentioned the Deutz. Leon had his own problem coming, though he did not know it yet. Leon Boone farmed 700 acres east of the Briggs place on ground that had a tendency to stay wet longer than the surrounding fields because of a clay layer 12 inches down that slowed drainage. In a dry fall, Leon's ground came in fine. In a wet fall, it was the last ground in the county to be ready and the first to cause trouble. His 4450 had been working at the edge of what it was designed to handle, pulling through conditions that packed mud and chaff into the radiator screen faster than Leon was cleaning it out. Leon was also running a coolant mixture that was lighter on antifreeze than it should have been. Chester did not know this specifically, but he knew the way farmers in the county maintained their machines, carefully in the areas they could see and sometimes loosely in the areas they could not. And coolant mixture was an area most men checked in October, if they checked it at all, which was after the harvest pressure was off and before the serious cold arrived. In September 1993, with crops still standing in the field and machines running dawn to dusk, nobody in Custer County was checking their antifreeze. The forecast came in on a Friday. Chester heard it on the radio in the Deutz cab at 4 in the afternoon on October 20th. The National Weather Service was issuing a hard freeze warning for the region. Overnight lows expected to reach the single digits by October 23rd. The temperature that afternoon was 51 degrees. The forecast was calling for a drop of more than 40 degrees in 72 hours. He sat in the cab and listened to the report twice. Then he turned the radio off and sat in the quiet for a moment. Chester thought about the county around him, about how wet the fall had been, and how the radiator screens looked on every John Deere he had seen in the past 6 weeks, packed with the particular mixture of dried mud and chaff and field debris that a wet Nebraska harvest produces. He thought about antifreeze ratios and coolant levels and thermostats that had been cycling hard for 6 weeks in conditions they were not designed to handle. He thought about how no one had winterized because no one had time to winterize, because the ground was still too wet and the crops were still standing. And the pressure of an unfinished harvest does not create space for thinking about what happens when the temperature drops 40 degrees in 3 days. Then he thought about the fin cylinders on the engine behind him and the fan in its tin shroud and the complete absence of anything inside this machine that cold weather could reach and break. Chester drove the Deutz back to the shed at the end of the day and parked it inside and closed the shed door. Checked the oil. Brushed the fin cylinders clean. Checked the fuel level and the hydraulic fluid and the transmission oil. He did everything he would have done on any other evening, and he did it without hurrying. Then he went inside and told Nora there was a hard freeze coming. Nora asked when. Chester said Wednesday night. She set her dish towel down on the counter and looked at him. Nora knew enough about farming and enough about machines and enough about what the past 3 years had meant to understand what a hard freeze meant for every liquid-cooled tractor in Custer County after 6 weeks of wet harvest that had kept every farmer too busy to prepare for winter. Neither of them said anything. They stood in the kitchen in the particular silence that falls between people who have been through enough together to know when something is coming. Chester opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out the brown leather notebook. He set it on the table and did not open it, just left it there while Nora made supper and the radio on the counter gave the forecast again at 6 o'clock, and the wind picked up outside the kitchen window, and the temperature was already dropping through the 40s. The notebook sat on the table between them like something that had been waiting a long time to be relevant. By Tuesday evening, the temperature had fallen to 28 degrees, and frost covered the tractor seats, and the mud in the fields had begun to stiffen at the surface. Chester walked out to the shed after supper and looked at the Deutz in the beam of his flashlight, and then walked back to the house. There was nothing to check that he had not already checked. The machine was ready. It had been ready for 3 years. What came next was not his to control. Wednesday night, the temperature fell through 20 degrees before midnight and kept falling. Chester lay in bed and listened to the wind against the bedroom window and thought about the copper tubes in Dale's radiator core, packed with dried mud and running coolant that had been cycling hard since September. He thought about Leon's 4450 sitting in the field overnight because Leon had been too exhausted to drive it back to the shed on Tuesday, which Chester knew because he had seen it from the road when he drove past Leon's place that afternoon. The green cab sitting dark and alone in the middle of the harvested ground with the temperature already falling. He thought about what expanding ice does inside a cast iron engine block when there is not enough antifreeze in the coolant to keep it liquid at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not sleep much. At 4:30 in the morning, Chester got up and dressed and went to the kitchen and made coffee. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 9 degrees. The sky was completely clear and the stars were very bright, the way they are when the air has no moisture left in it. He drank his coffee standing at the window and looked out at the yard and the shed and the flat frozen ground beyond it and waited for it to be light enough to go to work. He had been right about all of it: the mud in the radiator screens, the coolant ratios, the thermostats cycling past their limits for 6 weeks in conditions that ground them down quietly and without warning. He had been right about every part of what was coming and had not said a word of it to anyone, because there was no version of that conversation that ended well for Chester Briggs in Custer County in the fall of 1993. And so he had kept it to himself and waited, the way his grandfather had kept certain things to himself and waited. And now the waiting was over, and the morning was here, and it was 9 degrees outside the kitchen window. Chester set the cup in the sink and pulled on his coat and went out to the shed. The yard was crusted hard underfoot, the mud from the previous week frozen into ridges and ruts that held his weight without flexing. His breath came out in a steady white column and dissipated in the still air. The shed door was stiff in its track from the cold, and he had to pull it with both hands to get it moving. Inside, the Deutz sat exactly where he had left it the night before. Frost on the hood and frost on the seat, and the fin cylinders coated with a thin skin of ice crystals that caught the beam of the overhead light. He climbed into the cab. The seat was cold through his work pants. He pulled the door shut and sat for a moment. The dash was simple: fuel gauge, oil pressure, hour meter, throttle. No coolant temperature gauge, because there was no coolant. Chester set the throttle to the cold start position and engaged the intake air heater, a glow plug system that warmed the combustion chamber before the first compression stroke. He held it for 30 seconds. Then he turned the key and hit the starter. The engine cranked slowly. The oil in the pan was cold and thick, and the starter groaned against the resistance of 6 cylinders fighting cold compression. He held the key. The engine turned over 4 times, 5 times, 6. The sound of it labored and reluctant in the frozen shed. He released the key and engaged the air heater again and held it for another 30 seconds. On the second attempt, the engine caught on the third crank. It came up rough, firing unevenly on the outer cylinders first while the centers came online, blowing a cloud of white smoke out the exhaust stack that rolled up to the shed ceiling and spread along the rafters. Chester held the throttle steady at low idle and waited. The roughness lasted 40 seconds. Then the engine smoothed, the cylinders evening out one by one until the idle settled into the particular rhythm of the Deutz 6, a slightly different cadence from any American diesel Chester had ever run, a tone that was its own thing. No coolant temperature gauge climbing toward operating range. No thermostat deciding when to open. Just the engine and the air and the fins and the fan. The same system it had always been. Indifferent to the temperature outside because temperature outside was not something it depended on. Chester let it warm at idle for 10 minutes. Then he put it in gear and drove it out of the shed into the frozen yard. The sun was not up yet. The eastern sky was gray at the horizon, and the stars were still visible overhead, and the frozen ground of Custer County stretched away in every direction in the pre-dawn dark, hard and pale and silent. He drove out of the yard and onto the county road and turned east toward the cornfield along the north fence line that he had not finished before the weather turned. The field was iron. 3 days of dropping temperatures had driven the frost 18 inches into the ground in some places, and the mud that had been pulling at the Deutz's rear axle for 6 weeks was now concrete. Chester lowered the header and put the machine in gear, and the Deutz moved into the standing corn without hesitation. The frozen ground carrying the weight of the machine without flexing, the stalks snapping off clean in the cold air. He was running before the sun came up. Dale Mercer found the puddle at 5:30 in the morning. He walked into his machine shed the way he walked into it every morning, without particular expectation, and he saw the green stain on the concrete floor before he saw anything else. It was spread in an irregular shape beneath the front axle of the 4440, roughly 2 feet across, still wet at the center where it had not yet frozen to the floor. He stood looking at it for a moment before he understood what it was. Then he crouched down and looked under the machine. The crack ran through 3 rows of copper tubes in the lower section of the radiator core. The mud that had packed into the fins over 6 weeks of wet harvest had frozen solid during the night, and the expanding ice had split the tubes the way ice splits anything that cannot flex, cleanly and completely, while the coolant drained out through the gaps and pooled on the shed floor and began to freeze at the edges by the time Dale found it. The tractor was dead, not broken in a way that an hour's work and a trip to the parts counter would fix. The radiator core needed replacement, which meant a part number, which meant a call to Pinnacle Iron, which meant waiting for Frank to source a unit from the regional warehouse, which meant days at minimum and possibly longer if the warehouse was running short after every other county in the region had the same night that Chester had predicted without saying so to anyone. Dale straightened up and stood in his shed with his hands at his sides and looked at the machine. His corn was not finished. He had 300 acres in the east section that had been too wet to combine before the freeze. And now the ground was hard enough to run on, and his combine was ready, and his grain cart was ready, and the machine that pulled the grain cart was standing in a puddle of its own coolant on a concrete floor in the dark. He went inside and called Pinnacle Iron at 6 in the morning and got the answering service. Frank called back at 7:15 and listened to the description and said he would check the parts situation. He called back at 9 and said the radiator core for a 4440 was on a 4-day back order from the regional warehouse because the warehouse had received 17 calls that morning from dealers across 3 counties and the available stock was already spoken for. 4 days. Dale's corn stood in the frozen field and waited. Leon Boone did not find a puddle. Leon's situation announced itself differently. He had left the 4450 in the field overnight on Tuesday, too exhausted to drive it back to the shed after a 16-hour day, and the machine had sat in the open through the coldest night of the year with coolant mixed lighter on antifreeze than it should have been, and a block full of water jacket passages that had been holding marginal temperatures for 6 weeks. Leon drove out to the field at first light in his pickup and climbed into the 4450's cab and turned the key. The starter cranked. The engine did not fire. He cycled the glow plugs and tried again. Still nothing. He got out and walked around the machine and noticed the stain on the frozen ground beneath the engine, a dark, wet area spread around the base of the block. He crouched down with his flashlight and looked under the machine. The crack was in the block itself, not the radiator. It ran along the water jacket passage adjacent to the number 4 cylinder, a clean fracture in the cast iron where the expanding ice had found the wall too thin to hold. When Leon tried the key a second time, coolant ran out of the crack in a steady stream and pooled in the frozen ground beneath the machine. Leon stood up and looked at the horizon. The sun was coming up red over the harvested ground to the east. The field was frozen flat and silent in every direction. The 4-4-5-0 sat in the middle of it, dead, in a way that a cracked radiator is not dead, dead in the way that requires a remanufactured long block from a warehouse in another state and a machine shop to install it and a wait measured in weeks rather than days. Leon got in his pickup and drove home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time before he called anyone. Chester knew none of the specific details of these mornings as they happened. He was in the field. He had been in the field since before sunrise, and he intended to stay there until the light was gone, because the ground was frozen solid and carrying the Deutz cleanly, and the corn was coming off dry, and the bins were not yet full, and there was nothing in the world he needed to do more urgently than finish his harvest while the conditions held. The Deutz ran without a missed beat through the morning. The temperature climbed from 9 degrees at sunrise to 19 by 10 o'clock and stopped there. The kind of October cold that does not apologize or pretend it will improve. Chester ran in his coat and his work gloves and stopped once to add fuel from the tank in the bed of his pickup and once to check the oil and the hydraulic fluid and brush a light accumulation of chaff off the fin cylinders. The whole stop took 11 minutes. Then he was running again. At 10 in the morning, Dale's blue pickup appeared at the edge of the field. Chester saw it from the cab, sitting on the county road at the field's edge, the engine running. He made his pass to the far end and turned the machine and came back up the adjacent row, and at the near headland he was close enough to see Dale through the windshield, sitting behind the wheel with both hands on it, watching the Deutz move through the rows. Chester did not stop the machine. He was in the middle of a run, and the corn was coming off clean, and stopping mid-field for a social conversation was not something he did even in ordinary circumstances. He made the turn at the headland and went back the other direction, and when he came around again at the far end, the pickup was still there. Chester finished the pass and turned and came north again, and when he reached the headland nearest the road, he pulled to a stop and cut the header and sat with the engine idling. He waited. Dale did not get out of the truck. He sat behind the wheel for another few minutes, looking at the Deutz. Then he put the truck in reverse and backed onto the road and drove away. Chester watched the truck go. Then he engaged the header and put the machine in gear and went back to work. He ran 31 hours across 3 days. The second morning, Leon Boone came out. He drove his truck into the field approach and got out and walked across the frozen ground to where Chester had the Deutz idling at the headland while checking the grain cart level. Leon walked up and stood a few feet away and looked at the fin cylinders and the fan shroud and the space at the front of the engine where the radiator was not. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked how much Chester had paid for it. Chester told him, $27,500 at the consignment sale in Kearney, minus the $21,500 trade-in on the 4840 net cost, $6,000. Leon said nothing. He looked at the engine one more time. He shook his head, not the way Dale had shaken his head 2 years ago in the driveway, not with contempt or dismissal, just the slow acknowledgement of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a number that does not feel good. Then Leon walked back to his truck and drove away. Chester climbed back into the cab and put the machine in gear. He finished his harvest on the evening of the third day. He drove the Deutz back to the shed in the dark, the headlights cutting across the frozen yard, and pulled it inside and cut the engine. The silence after 31 hours of running was complete and sudden. Chester sat in the cab for a moment and listened to the fin cylinders ticking as they cooled. He got out and checked the oil and the hydraulic fluid and brushed the fin cylinders clean and checked the fuel level for the next morning. Then he went inside. The reckoning that followed was not Chester's to experience. It happened in other machine sheds and other kitchens and at the parts desk at Pinnacle Iron, where Frank's phone rang steadily from 6 in the morning through the end of the business day for 10 consecutive days after the freeze. Dale's radiator core came in on day 5. The part cost $1,800 plus labor. Pinnacle Iron's service schedule was backed up 2 weeks, so Dale hired a mechanic from a shop in Callaway to come out and install it, which added another $400 and a full day's time. 9 days from the morning, Dale found the coolant on his shed floor to the morning his 444 started again. His corn stood in the frozen field through all of it, and when he finally got back to work, the test weight had dropped 2 points from moisture cycling in the cold, which cut his price at the elevator by a small but real amount on every bushel. Leon's situation was different in scale. The remanufactured long block for a 4450 came from a supplier in Peoria, Illinois. 14 days to ship, another week for the machine shop in Grand Island to install it, because the local shop did not have the equipment for an engine of that size. 3 weeks total, from the morning Leon found the crack to the morning his 4450 started again. His corn had been standing in the field for 6 weeks before the freeze. It stood for 3 more weeks after it. When Leon finally combined it, the test weight was down 4 points on the majority of the field. At the elevator, 4 points of test weight translated to a price reduction of 30 cents per bushel. On 700 acres of corn, 30 cents per bushel was a number that sat on Leon's kitchen table through November and December and did not get smaller the longer he looked at it. Leon called his loan officer at the bank in the second week of November. Chester heard about that conversation not from Leon, but from Virgil Cross, who had a way of knowing things in the county without appearing to seek them out. Virgil mentioned it one afternoon when he stopped by in late November, standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, saying that Leon was having a hard time with the bank over the operating line and was probably going to have to sell some ground in the spring to cover the gap. Virgil looked at the shed where the Deutz was parked and then looked back at Chester. Chester did not say anything. Virgil said, "You knew it was coming." The freeze. Chester said he knew what the forecast said. Virgil said, "That's not what I mean." Chester looked at him. Virgil said, "You knew what a wet fall does to radiators. You've been watching it since September." Chester said he had some thoughts about it. Virgil nodded. He looked at the frozen yard for a moment. He said his brother had lost his farm in Phelps County in 1978. Equipment costs had been part of it. Not all of it, but part. He said he had been watching Chester's fuel numbers since that first April when Chester told him in the field, and the numbers had said what they said, and then October said what it said. Chester said, "I'm sorry about your brother," Virgil said. It was a long time ago. They stood in the yard for another minute without talking. Then Virgil said he had been looking at a Fendt, European machine, air-cooled, fuel-efficient, not a Deutz, but the same philosophy. Said he was not sure yet. Said he was thinking about it. Chester said, "Come by in the spring. I'll show you the fuel logs from the last 3 years." Virgil said he would. Then he drove away. The December that followed was quieter than most. The co-op conversations had changed in the way that conversations change when the thing everyone has been joking about turns out not to be a joke. The jokes had stopped. In their place was a particular silence, the silence of men who were correct about what they said, but cannot remember exactly when they stopped being correct and started being wrong. And so they say nothing rather than locate that moment and stand in it. Dale came into the co-op one morning in the middle of December when Chester was there picking up a bag of water softener salt. Dale came in through the front door and stopped when he saw Chester, and there was a half-second adjustment in his expression, the kind that happens before a man decides how to proceed. Dale walked over, said good morning. Chester said good morning back. Dale said his radiator had come in, said the machine was running again. Chester said that was good to hear. Dale looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said he had a question about the fin cylinders on the Deutz, specifically about how Chester cleaned them during wet conditions to keep the airflow clear. Said he had been thinking about cooling system maintenance and had some thoughts about whether there was a better approach than what he had been doing. Chester looked at him. Dale Mercer was not a man who asked questions easily. The asking of this particular question had cost him something. Chester told him about the parts brush and the 10-minute evening routine and the difference between cleaning something daily in small amounts and trying to clean it all at once after it had packed solid, said it was not complicated, said it was just about doing it every day before it became a problem instead of once a week after it already was. Dale listened without looking away. He said, 10 minutes a day. Chester said, 10 minutes a day. Dale said, all right. He nodded once. Then he went to get what he had come for, and Chester got the salt, and they went their separate ways, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was the whole conversation. It was the closest thing to an apology that would ever exist between them. And Chester understood that and accepted it for what it was, which was the most that a man like Dale was going to give, and more than Chester had expected. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening in the third week of November. Chester was at the kitchen table going over the harvest numbers, the legal pad open in front of him with 3 columns of figures representing the 1993 season. The fuel savings had been real again, consistent with the 2 previous years, and the operating line was in better shape than it had been in 1990. The farm was standing. The math had worked. He picked up the phone. It was Frank Steele. Frank said, "Good evening," and Chester said good evening back, and there was a brief pause of the kind that precedes a question a man is not entirely comfortable asking. Frank said he was looking for a contact, said he had a customer asking about air-cooled diesel options, and he was trying to find the right person to talk to. Said he understood Chester had been working with a dealer in Lincoln. Chester stood at the kitchen counter and held the phone and looked at the wall. He thought about Frank in the service bay 3 years ago, hands in his pockets, saying you're going from a 4840 to a Deutz Alice in the tone of a verdict. He thought about the parts desk that didn't stock his filters and made him wait 2 weeks. He thought about the particular way Frank had handled the trade-in paperwork, efficiently and without warmth, the way you handle a transaction with someone who has already made up their mind about something you consider a mistake. Frank Steele was not calling to apologize. He was calling because he had a customer and he needed a number. That was the entire transaction. Chester understood that and held no expectation of anything more. Chester told him the name of the contact in Lincoln, gave him the phone number from memory, the same number August Decker had given him in the Kearney consignment yard in the spring of 1991. He read it out clearly so Frank could write it down. Frank thanked him. Chester said he was welcome. Frank hung up. Chester set the phone down and stood at the counter for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the yard was dark, and the shed was dark, and the frozen ground of Custer County was dark in every direction. He went back to the table and sat down and looked at the legal pad. The 1993 fuel savings column showed $11,430 saved compared to operating 3 John Deere tractors at 1990 consumption rates. 3 years of savings totaled just over $34,000. The operating line was healthy. The farm was standing. The barn where his grandfather had kept horses before the first tractor arrived in 1947 was still standing too, the wood gray and soft, but the frame sound. And Chester could see it from the kitchen window in the daytime if he looked in the right direction. He took the brown leather notebook from the drawer and set it on the table beside the legal pad. He did not open it, just left it there. His grandfather's handwriting inside it. 50 years of careful observation recorded in pencil light enough to almost disappear. The record of a man who had paid attention to every cost and every yield and every repair and had kept the farm by knowing the distance between what things cost and what they were worth and never spending what existed in that gap on anything that did not need to be spent. Nora came in from the living room and saw the notebook and the legal pad side by side on the table. She said, "Is it good?" Chester said the numbers were good. Nora pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She looked at the legal pad for a moment. Then she looked at Chester. She said, "Margaret Mercer asked about you today, at the church office. She asked how the harvest went." Chester looked up. Nora said, "I told her it went fine." He held her eyes for a moment. Nora said, "She told me Dale had some trouble with his radiator." Chester said he had heard that. Nora said. She said she was glad we came through all right. Chester sat with that for a moment. Margaret Mercer had not spoken to Nora Briggs at any length since the spring of 1991. The Mercer women and the Briggs women had occupied the same church and the same community for 20 years, and the Frees had rearranged something between them, quietly and without announcement, in the way that events rearrange things without requiring anyone to acknowledge that the rearranging has occurred. Chester said, "That was kind of her." Nora said, "Yes, it was." She got up and went to the counter and came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Chester and kept one for herself and sat back down. They sat together at the kitchen table with the legal pad and the brown leather notebook between them and the frozen yard outside the window and the Deutz in the shed beyond it. And neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation between people who have shared enough to know what silence contains. Chester looked at the notebook. His grandfather had not won anything in the traditional sense when the bank came for the farm in 1933 and again in 1936, had not beaten anyone, had not been vindicated in any public way that the county recognized or celebrated. He had simply refused to sell what was his and kept the costs lower than the income and recorded every number in a notebook small enough to fit in the front pocket of his overalls. And one morning the bank stopped coming and the farm was still there and he went back to work. Chester thought about what Frank's phone call had been worth, not in dollars, in the particular currency of a small county where what people think of you is its own kind of economy. Frank Steele had called Chester Briggs on a Tuesday evening in November to ask for a phone number. He had not explained why, had not acknowledged what the previous 3 years had contained, had asked for the number, and Chester had given it to him, and that was the end of it. But a man who spent 19 years selling John Deere equipment in Custer County and believed in every square foot of that enterprise does not call a customer he considered a cautionary tale unless the world has shifted in a way he cannot ignore. The call was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was a question about a phone number. It was also the most Frank Steele was capable of giving, and Chester understood that, and it was enough. Spring came to Custer County without ceremony, the frost going out of the ground slowly from the top down, the fields going from white to gray to the particular brown of turned earth drying in the April sun. Chester planted on time. Both 4-4-4 OEs and the Deutz working together through a clean, dry April, the soil temperature reading 53 degrees by the second week, the planter dropping seed into ground that had wintered well and was ready. Virgil stopped at the edge of the east quarter one afternoon in the second week of April, while Chester was running the Deutz on the near end of the field. Chester saw the truck and pulled to the headland and stopped. Virgil got out and walked across the field approach. He looked at the Deutz for a moment. The fin cylinders in the afternoon light, the fan shroud, the empty space at the front of the engine. He said he had ordered the Fent. Chester said, "When does it come?" Virgil said, "June." He said it was a different animal than the Deutz. More power, more hydraulics, more electronics than he was comfortable with. But the fuel numbers were right, and the dealer situation was better than what Chester had dealt with, and he had done the math the same way Chester had done the math, and the math said the same thing it had always said. Chester nodded. Virgil said, "I should have done it 2 years ago." Chester said, "You did it when you were ready." Virgil looked at him, then looked at the Deutz again. He said, "Dale's been asking around about Fent, too. Hasn't ordered anything yet, but he's been asking." Chester said, "Is that right?" Virgil said, "Leon sold the East 200 in March. Bank deal. He said Leon was going to be all right, but it was going to take a few years." Chester said he was sorry to hear it. Virgil said he is too. They stood in the field for another minute. The Deutz idled between them, the 6-cylinder diesel turning over at low speed, the sound of it steady and even and particular to itself. Virgil said, "Your grandfather built this place." Chester said, "He did, 1929. Virgil said, Mine built his in 1934. Bad time to start, Chester said. They built them to last. Virgil looked at the field and then back at Chester. He said, yes, they did. He walked back to his truck and drove away. Chester sat in the Deutz for a moment after the truck was gone, the engine idling, the fin cylinders warm in the afternoon sun. The east quarter stretched away in front of him, the rows running straight to the far fence line, the same ground his grandfather had laid out with a hand level and a stake line in a spring not so different from this one. Chester put the machine in gear. The Deutz moved forward into the field, the planter lowering behind it, the seed dropping into the warm ground in the steady rhythm that the machine had maintained since the first day Chester brought it home. Reliable and even and indifferent to what anyone in Custer County had thought of it. The radiator had never been a safety feature. Chester had understood that from the test reports and the consignment yard and the six-cylinder engine sitting in its own clean air. The county had understood it on the morning of October 23, 1993, when the frost on the machines told the truth that fuel logs and test reports had been telling for 3 years. But understanding a thing and living with it long enough for it to mean something were two different intervals of time, and Chester had needed the second one as much as the first. He ran to the far fence line and turned and came back, the Deutz holding its line, the ground opening ahead of it row by row, the April light flat and clean over everything. Behind him, the rows ran straight back to the shed where the brown leather notebook sat in the kitchen drawer. And ahead of him, the field ran to the fence his grandfather had strung on cedar posts cut from the breaks along the creek in 1931. And Chester Briggs drove the machine that nobody had believed in across the ground that nobody had been able to take. And the work continued the way it had always continued, without fanfare, without conclusion, one row at a time.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant What can I learn the moment I embrace the fire? The fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never